We're about to dive into a truly shocking scenario pulled directly from our source material. It's a hypothetical secret U.S. military raid to kidnap a sitting head of state. Now, this isn't some Hollywood movie plot. This is a detailed plan, codenamed Operation Absolute Resolve, and it brings up some huge questions about power, international law, and really, the future of our world order. So let's get right into it.
Okay, so picture this. Our source sets the scene in a heavily curtained room somewhere in Florida. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, the only light in the room is coming from a bunch of screens, and sitting right in front of them is the President of the United States, watching a live feed of his army in action thousands of miles away.
And who's the target on that live feed? Well, it's the President of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. He's asleep in his residence in the capital, Caracas. According to this scenario, he has absolutely no idea that in just a few minutes, his life is about to be turned upside down by foreign commandos.
Now, our source attributes this quote to the president as he's watching the whole thing unfold. It was just like watching television. I mean, that really says it all, doesn't it? It captures just how surreal and detached modern warfare can be. A massive international incident playing out like some kind of prime-time drama.
So how did this whole thing actually go down? Well, this first part breaks down the play-by-play of this hypothetical raid, Operation Absolute Resolve, just as it's laid out in our source.
The plan was, incredibly detailed. First up, infiltration. You've got American helicopters flying just 100 feet off the water, totally hugging the ocean to stay under the radar. Then, boom, a citywide blackout. A cyber attack just plunges the entire capital of Caracas into darkness. Next, the assault. Elite Delta Force commandos drop right onto Maduro's roof. And then, the capture. Maduro's awake by now. He's making a run for a safe room, but it's too late. They've got him in under 5 minutes.
So the next morning, the world wakes up to this news, and there's really just one massive question on everyone's mind. Why? I mean, what could possibly justify one country kidnapping the elected leader of another? This is the central mystery we're going to dig into next.
All right, let's start with the official justification. The story that the administration puts out in this scenario isn't about politics, it's not about power, it's about drugs. So the whole legal foundation for this raid was a formal indictment from the Southern District of New York. And the charges were serious. We're talking narco-terrorism, cocaine importation, and weapons violations. This legal angle was absolutely crucial because it let them frame this massive military operation as just a simple law enforcement action against an international criminal. But here's where the official story starts to get a little shaky, according to our source. It points out that Venezuela is actually a pretty minor transit country for cocaine, and most of what does pass through is headed for Europe, not the US. The bulk of America's cocaine, it claims, actually comes from totally different countries through the Pacific.
And here's another thing. The source points out that America's deadliest drug crisis by far comes from fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that has no known link to Venezuela whatsoever. So if the whole point was to save American lives from drugs, you have to ask, why target Maduro? And that brings us to the source's main argument. If it wasn't really about drugs, then what was it about? Well, the answer, in a single word, is oil. The reason is pretty straightforward. Venezuela doesn't just have a little bit of oil. It has the largest proven crude oil reserves on the entire planet. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran. We're talking 303 billion barrels. Just a staggering amount of wealth and power sitting right there under the ground.
And this whole fight over oil, it's not new. It's been building for 100 years. U.S. companies piled in after oil was discovered way back in 1922. But that relationship went south and fast after President Hugo Chavez nationalized the entire industry in 2001, effectively kicking those companies out. According to our source, that one moment led to a failed coup attempt, crippling sanctions, and basically decades of hostility. And if there was any doubt left about the real motive, the source points to this alleged quote from the president the day after the raid. He apparently called Venezuela's decision to nationalize its own oil the greatest theft in the history of America. With words like that, the whole story gets reframed, doesn't it?
Now, you can't just do something like this and expect the world to stay quiet. The fallout was immediate, it was global, and it raised some really serious questions about whether this whole thing was even legal.
The international condemnation was swift, and it came from everywhere. It wasn't just rivals like Russia and China. It came from key Latin American and European nations, too. The UN Secretary General called it a flat-out violation of the UN Charter, and a lot of people started using this powerful phrase, New Age colonialism.
So how did the administration get around the U.S. Congress, which is supposed to approve any act of war? Well, they were very careful with their words. They didn't call it a war. They called it a law enforcement function to arrest an indicted criminal. It's a legal distinction that's really designed to sidestep all those constitutional checks and balances.
But let's ask the obvious question here. Can you really call this a law enforcement function? The source material brings up two key pieces of data that really challenge that idea. First, just look at the sheer scale of it. Over 150 military aircraft launched from 20 different bases. I mean, come on, that's not a police raid. That is a full-blown military mobilization.
And second, the human cost. The source reports that 40 people were killed in preliminary airstrikes on the city's air defense systems. These are not the actions of a law enforcement agency. By any normal definition, this is an act of war.
And all of this brings us to the final and maybe the most important part of this whole story, the consequences. Our source argues that an operation like this sets an incredibly dangerous new precedent for the rest of the world.
At the very heart of this issue is international law, specifically Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. This article is basically a cornerstone of global stability. It explicitly says you can't use military force against another country's independence, so the raid is presented as a flagrant violation of this super important principle.
The source material basically boils this whole thing down to a simple and pretty cynical philosophy that rules are for the weak and the powerful can do whatever they want. It suggests a belief that if you have the biggest military in the world, you get to make the rules, and you also get to decide when to break them.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty chilling question to think about. If, in this scenario, America gets to do this, what stops China from doing it? Or Russia? What happens to the whole idea of a rules-based international order when military might becomes the only rule that really matters?